Hamatakiapi. This is Nick Estes here with the Red Nation podcast. We are joined by a special friend of mine, comrade, somebody who I have a lot of respect for, David Adler. David, welcome to the show. It's good to see you. It's good to hear from you. You look well. Do you want to start by introducing yourself and where you're calling from?
Sure. Thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to join you all, and it's a pleasure to see you again, Nick. It's been a long time. My name is David Adler. I'm a political economist by training. I currently serve as the co-general coordinator of the Progressive International, a global coalition of trade unions and social movements and political parties across the world. And it was in that capacity as co-general coordinator that I was invited to take part in the recent Global Sumud Flotilla to break the siege and to deliver some pretty basic humanitarian supplies to the starving people of Gaza, of the Gaza Strip. And I'm speaking to you some days after our release from Israeli internment in the middle of the Negev desert, where we were subjected to some pretty awful conditions that I think are very revealing of the broader condition or disregard, disdain with which the state of Israel treats international law and condition of our Palestinian brothers and sisters, just on the other side of that camp, on the other side of that fence, on the other side of the border in Gaza.
Yeah, we were all watching not just this flotilla, but the ones that preceded it, as well as the ones that are currently ongoing. We are in a moment that's, I think being framed by the Western press as a moment of reprieve for Gazans. And I just want to make clear that the flotilla that you participated in was trying to break the siege. The siege of Gaza has been ongoing for decades now.
20 years.
In terms of 20 years, 2 decades, and has been restricting and choking off critical medical supplies, construction equipment, the prevention and the control of, not just goods, but also people in and out of Gaza. So maybe you can talk a little bit about the longer history of the siege, and then we can get into some of the details about the flotilla and the project of the flotillas to break the siege on Gaza.
Yeah, I think that one of the tasks that we have, especially now, 2 years into this genocide, which has marked a massive escalation of hostility, a massive escalation of the assault, longstanding assault on the occupied territories, on the Gaza Strip in particular, is to strip away layer by layer the normalization of violence, of criminality by the state of Israel. And to normalize it, it's always helpful to take it back into the realm of the hypothetical or bring it home, so to speak, to make the comparison. For example, I'm from Los Angeles, California. Can you imagine if the Chinese Communist Party woke up one morning and said, Angelinos no longer can swim in their ocean without us sniping their children when they want to swim. The port of Long Beach will remain not just closed, but we will destroy all port infrastructure, which is what the state of Israel has done to Gazan ports. So, of course, you can't fish, but you also can't, as you say, Nick, engage in commerce with the outside world. And then really critically for Gaza, which has, because of the state of Israel, because of terroristic violence of the state of Israel, no longer has an airport. So there's no freedom of movement for its people. So you can also not set sail from those shores to, be part of the broader Mediterranean community. One of the aspects of the flotilla was so powerful for its participants, but I think also for the people who were following our journey, is it's easy to forget in the, shall we say, orientalization of Palestine, the Middle Easternification of Palestine, that the shores of Gaza are shores on the Mediterranean Sea. That if you're vacationing in Mallorca or Ibiza, or you're visiting Naples or the Sicilian coast, this is the same sea where, of course, Africans on the move are repressed by the Libyan Coast Guard on the south side and the Italian and Greek Coast Guards on the other side. But in the Eastern Mediterranean, the same shores that Gazans gaze out on, they're gazing across the same sea that is considered to be the lap of luxury for U.S. American elites, as well as others around the world, for pleasure cruising and for island hopping and all the rest. So, it's very important, as you say, to put the siege into this broader context, because I also think it helps to explain why the flotilla movement, as you say, this initiative that's been around since 2008, is not going to end just because there's a temporary ceasefire. It's not going to end because Trump put forward a peace plan. It's not going to end until there is no longer this criminal, illegal, inhumane siege of Gaza that, of course, directly targets one of the major preconditions for Palestinian self-determination, which is having control, access to, democratic determination of what they want to do with their shoreline, with their borders, and with whom they want to conduct commerce, and how they want to move and trade, and all the rest. And that's why, even some days after this harrowing experience for many of the people who were joining me on the boats, we're already planning the next flotilla, in the same way that, even after the 2010 attacks on the Freedom Flotilla that were lethal on the Mare Marmara, where many Turkish activists were slaughtered by Israeli forces that raided their boats, it didn't deter the broader movement from continuing, because it won't stop until the siege is finally broken.
Yeah, thanks for that overview. It's so important to remember that Gaza is connected to the rest of the Mediterranean world, as you pointed out. And I remember there was somebody who was giving a talk on the power of water sovereignty, the right to access, waterways, whether they're rivers or in this case, oceans. They literally open us up to the world. I think we think of these terms like settler colonialism as dealing with land, but here you're showing like Gaza is connected to the European Mediterranean, that each of these countries who has a port into the Mediterranean can get on a ship, just as you did, and sail to Gaza. And it is such an indictment on the inability or the unwillingness of these nations, these European nations, these African nations, to not, facilitate any kind of humanitarian effort, and that it's being undertaken by activists such as yourself. And I also think that in the West, when there is conversation around the flotilla, it typically focuses on the Western faces of the flotilla, such as yourself. But I can't remember the exact number, but I think there was over 40 different nations and nationalities represented, many of them from, third world countries or countries from the global South who may not receive the same kind of recognition, such as yourself. So maybe you can talk a little bit about who makes up these flotillas, and the kind of training and preparation that you undergo to begin this sort of journey, this harrowing journey as civilians on a humanitarian mission.
So the Global Sumud Flotilla was unique in its scale and in its scope. This flotilla was larger than all the previous efforts combined. 45 nations represented on over 40 boats, with a total of 450 delegates, participants, representatives who were, on small sailing vessels or on little motor cruiser boats that were kicking along the Mediterranean Sea. And it brought together different fleets, one from Barcelona with a Maghreb fleet, as you say, bringing people out of the north of Africa, with an Italian fleet and a Greek fleet, from where different people were joining this great humanitarian mission. And so, of course, the training was to get people more disciplined and better prepared for a potential interception, for drone strikes, for the kinds of violence that we could encounter. Again, I don't want to normalize that violence. I think it's important that we strip this back and ask, what if any other country in international waters were to approve drone strikes on a humanitarian mission or on ordinary citizens in, a port of a third country? What would it mean if, under the cover of darkness, a fleet of quadricopters came and menaced, just some civilians on sailboats? We would never accept that, but somehow with the state of Israel we have. And so part of the training was being clear-minded about the risks that people were facing. And, Nick, like, I didn't plan to join the mission at the beginning. I had lots of things to do and was very busy. And What I wanted to do was go to Barcelona, which was the first port of departure, and I wanted to use my Spanish contacts, having lived and worked in Spain for a long time and knowing Barcelona quite well, to bring militants from local left parties and movements and unions down to the ports to give a big warm embrace and departure, as well as to work any back channeling with the Spanish government to ensure there was no bureaucratic sabotage that would prevent the boats from actually leaving the port, which is a big piece of this flotilla process, is how to avoid that bureaucracy, which always threatens, as has in the past, in the Turkish boats, which couldn't leave, or the Maltese boats, which weren't allowed to dock or were about to get flagged, as from the Greek boats that were constantly menaced by the authorities in trying to slow this thing down. But when I got to Barcelona, I was deeply inspired, as you say, by those people who were brought together from such disparate places around the world, from Indonesia and Malaysia to Brazil and Colombia, by this moral conviction and by solidaristic moral conviction. It wasn't just something must be done to halt this genocide, and we're going to do it. Of course, that was a powerful motivating force of this direct action. But it was a solidaristic logic, which is like, if we don't halt this genocide in Gaza, if we don't stand up for the people of Palestine, Malaysia will be next, or South Africa will be next, or Colombia will be next. And of course, we're seeing that play out now in the Caribbean with the, equally thuggish, equally illegal, equally menacing warfare that's now sort of building up in the skies over Venezuela. I think it's very interesting to think about the similarities between how the United States exercises this extrajudicial imperial violence in the Western Hemisphere, and how its 51st state exercises that violence in Palestine. But I think that that was a big piece of what brought these people together. And as a piece of that solidarity, just as you mentioned, one of the primary objectives of the occupation of the Palestinian territories, where Israel has not just seized control over what goes in and out of Gaza, but seized control of what goes in and out of Palestine. You can't, as you know, get into Palestine. Palestine doesn't have any. The state of Palestine has no independent entry points. They're choked off with entry points that are controlled by the state of Israel, whether that's the Allenby crossing out of Jordan, or indeed coming through Tel Aviv to try to get to East Jerusalem, or any of the myriad checkpoints in the middle. So one of the goals of that occupation is to kind of strip away, chip away, choke, and prevent the forging of stronger pan-Arab solidarities. It's very difficult for people from North Africa and the Arab world generally to get to Palestine. And that's not a coincidence. It's because one of the things that was most threatening to the state of Israel was that kind of pan-Arab solidarity, and still is. And so one of the most inspiring things about this flotilla, as you say, the Western faces, whatever, was I think this was like the largest number of pan-Arabist North Africans and Middle Easterners who were preparing to step foot in Gaza. And that, I think, is really, really scary and harrowing to a project that depends on the deactivation of those solidarities, whether locally, regionally, or globally. And so, seeing that, general tricontinental global Southern coalition travel across the world to be present in the Mediterranean Sea, combined with the courage of certain European or US American or Canadian, Western allies kind of stand up to their own countries and try to in defense of this principle, as well as the more specific pan-Arab solidarity. Seeing all those countries represented in this flotilla was one of the most inspiring aspects of it that, made me want to join and feel so lucky and privileged to be part of that mission, which was that we were making, like kind of a United Nations in miniature. We were kind of making a community of conscience that was more honest and more attuned to the global majority, to the global consensus on this genocide than we were seeing, and simultaneously, convened to the New York General Assembly, failing as it was to hold Israel accountable for the crimes against humanity that we've seen committed every day on our phone screens, wherever we be watching in the world.
Yeah, I think what you talk about is I think you call it the kind of collective community of conscience around the world, is that many of these people coming from even, these other states, outside of the European sort of sphere or the West, we would think that they would be very sympathetic to this cause, but oftentimes even those state governments act as, as we found out recently with this new ceasefire plan, is that many of these Arab nations were making security deals and agreements with Israel as this genocide unfolded, showing the sort of complicity of many of these states in the region, which is in many ways like in contradiction to what many of the people that live in these countries actually want and feel, and how they can't just walk to Gaza. They can't just, even though it's literally just a land border, if it's in Egypt or if it's in Jordan, or even if it's in Lebanon. So I think there's also this other element that you're talking about, is like there's such a projection of power of Israel to not only bend these nation states to its will in terms of vilifying, criminalizing things such as humanitarian missions. Obviously they've killed humanitarians the world over during this genocide, but also how almost from the very get-go, there was this, there began the threat of military violence by Israel on this flotilla. And I think that was what was shocking to a lot of people. Like even now, it's shocking, but it's not surprising, right? That there was an order that came from Benjamin Netanyahu's office about the drone strike that was carried out on the flotilla. Can you talk about the instances in which there were direct military attacks that were seeming apparent or confirmed during this flotilla, but also like the kind of sense of like what were people feeling? How were they feeling on the flotilla ships? What kind of atmosphere did it create?
So the first drone strike that happened on my boat, the family boat, was, as you say, shocking if not surprising. This is something that we've seen Israel do before. They did in the Conscience boat. They attacked them off the coast of Malta. They've menaced the Handala boat. I mean, this is something that is a pattern. But the fact of the pattern, Nick, and the fact of the strike as it was in Sidi Bou Said was shocking for two reasons, again, if not surprising. Reason number one was that the boat was less than a kilometer from the presidential palace of Tunisia, in the port of Sidi Bou Said. So part of this was like, it's one thing to attack a humanitarian mission under the cover of darkness in the middle of the international waters, which they did about a week later. But it's another to attack the sovereign nation of Tunisia in such a flagrant way. And so part of what was shocking was seeing just how far the state of Israel was willing to go. Of course, on the same day, within 24 hours, they bombed Yemen, they bombed southern Lebanon, they bombed Syria, and they bombed Doha that same day. So part of what was shocking was measuring the extent to which the state of Israel had just lost the plot and was completely acting as was according to its impunity. But the other shocking aspect was how it was received by the international community. So you mentioned people were shocked, or people were dismayed and concerned about the violence against the flotilla, but certain people were not. I mean, the Tunisian authorities, within 20 minutes of the first attack, had come out with a statement saying this was actually a cigarette or an electrical failure on the boats. And that had been very quickly seized and circulated by the Zionist bots on social media, as well as by the Western press, to say, oh, it's a he said, she said game. Activists allege this attack. And, the Tunisian authorities say otherwise. And Grok, what do you think? And Grok would say, well, here are these competing claims. It wasn't until the next day when we had another round of CCTV footage of another drone strike with another explosive device that was launched onto the second largest vessel of the convoy, where the Tunisians finally changed their tune, walked their story back, and agreed to call it premeditated aggression against our convoy, and where we could finally try to start to move the press to be less flat-footed and more honest about the reporting based on these footage, these videos that were irrefutable in their way. By that time, though, like the the story for a lot of these newspapers or these publications had been written, that it was like uh, a two-sided debate about this kind of violence. So in that sense, on the one hand, if you ask me about the feeling or the vibe on the mission, on the one hand, there was a sense of like, okay, we need to be clear-minded about what we're up against here. There is no guarantee of our safety, our security, and certainly the solidarities of our respective governments. Like, we are on our own, and in that sense, we need to all be clear-minded and honest about the risks that we're facing. On the other, there was a sense of like double down determination. That the next day after, especially after the first drone strike, we all got together in a big general assembly, and there was this echoing question through the hall of like, are we still doing this? And every single person said, hell yes, we're still doing this. We're not going to be intimidated. We're not going to be dissuaded, discouraged from continuing on with this mission. Now, the second wave of drone strikes was, I would say, scarier. This was a 4-hour attack in international waters when we were completely, on our own and not close to any shoreline, where between 2 and 5:30 in the morning, maybe, we just heard explosion after explosion after explosion of these quadricopters dropping C4 charges onto small sailing boats. We didn't know who was alive, or if the boats were damaged, or what was going to happen to our friends and comrades who were on those boats. And that was because our communications were all jammed while we were trying to speak to each other and get that kind of information from the respective captains and crews in the boats. And that was really scary. That was like, okay, well, on the one hand, we are a magnet for this kind of madness. We are in some ways attracting, Israel to react and to lash out at us, and we're going to try to use some political jujitsu to try to transfer that aggression into a further vehicle for mobilization in the countries represented on the flotilla. And so there's a sense in which, okay, there's an interesting challenge here in the pure politics of the flotilla, which is how can you be part of and a lightning rod for these social mobilizations that were already galloping forward in places as disparate as Johannesburg, London, and Milan, right? On the other hand, there was a sense of like, okay, well, it's time for some courage and conviction here, because anything can happen to us on the sea, and it's up to us to protect our own lives and to be disciplined and clear-minded about, or disciplined and well trained in the protocols related to drones and interceptions. Double down on drone watches, double down on training for how to use a fire extinguisher or whatever, but yeah, that mix of determination, preparation, and ambient anxiety that we're trying to translate into political action, I think was the result of some of these preliminary attacks that we confronted on the flotilla.
Yeah, thanks for that. It just seems like there was an escalation on their part to sort of create fear and intimidation against the flotilla, but also to kind of call the bluff of these nations like Tunisia. Like, what are you going to do? What are you going to do about this? And we've seen, in some ways that this impunity that has been granted to Israel and its genocide. I think there was, Gustavo Petro said it best. It's like, this is going to be expanded to the rest of the world. This is not just an attack on Palestinians. This is an attack on anyone who dares stand up against empire. As the days sort of unfolded, a lot of us were watching the live stream and getting WhatsApp updates from many of you. Can you talk about the hours, the day and the hour leading up to the interception? I think there were many who thought that it was going to happen sooner. I think many thought that the protection of I think it was the Italian Navy or the Spanish Navy, like this gesture that they had said we're going to send, battleships, like as part of like some kind of rescue mission. I don't even think they said they were going to protect the flotilla. I think there was more of like, well, if they bomb the flotilla, we'll be there to save people. Can you just talk about that sort of the feeling that was like leading up to this? Because at some point, these battleships turned around and kind of left the flotilla up to the the whims of the Israeli Navy. Yeah, just if you can talk about that time period and like leading up to the interception and what it was like and the sort of information you were getting on the boats.
Yeah, I had at that point taken over quite a bit of the coordination of the kind of political and diplomatic channels and trying to alert allies to what was happening. And, so we got the news pretty quickly that the ships were turning around as we entered the red zone. And, we resolved a basic thing of like, okay, yeah, we're on our own. All we've got is the strength of the mobilizations, the strength of our support back at home, and our own collective determination to break this siege. And at some point, we got warning that, the interception was imminent of some of these ships, but that was, not even a factor for the rest of the ships that remained, because the whole goal of the Global Sumud Flotilla and being so large and so diverse and traveling in a single convoy was, this has never been tried before. Let's test the structural integrity of this siege. Let's see how far we can get. So even when we were being menaced, chased down by a big naval barge trying to break our little sailboat in half, or told by a smaller boat, spraying skunk water on all the boats to destroy all the electronics, turn off your engines, we're taking your boats. We just kept on sailing, hour after hour after hour. And we kept sailing into the night, The first boats were taken at 9 p.m. Our boat, the Owila, which was full of veterans of conscience and friends from Ireland and Norway, United States, we sailed from 9 p.m. just onward till 4 o'clock in the morning. And there were moments that were scary because they were trying to chase us down. They were trying to kill us, I would say. And one of the things that was very Israeli about it was that they would turn off, they would use their boats as signal jammers. So we would lose access to the internet. We would lose access to our CCTVs. They would just go on and offline. And it was clear that this was all geared towards allowing Israeli naval authorities to operate under the cover of darkness, to make up whatever story was necessary or convenient for them, should there be casualties, should there be fatalities. It was going to give them that plausible deniability that Israel plays with constantly, to say, oh, this happened, to lie, essentially, and to wait for the Western press or Western representatives to catch up with those lies, as they've been so slow to do over time. Where they say, we didn't bomb that hospital. That was a failed Hamas rocket. And then it turns out they did bomb the hospital, but by then you moved on to something else. So that was, I think, what was scary about it. But there were moments where we just thought, we're going to get there. We're going to break the siege. We're going to get to the shores of Gaza, and we're going to deliver this aid. And I think that's the spirit that motivates a lot of the flotilla work for 20 years, even through the fatalities, through the killing, through the bureaucratic sabotage, is just like, this thing will collapse. We will push and press and organize and fight and sail until this thing is done. And so I think there was a sense of being spiritually and politically buoyed by the other members of the boat, who were, even as one person or another would get caught up in a moment of anxiety or fear, just be like, we're all in this together, and look across this convoy. It's so beautiful. Everyone's being menaced by the same naval authorities, but here we are. We're an armada of humanitarian vessels that is sailing to break this illegal siege. So something really beautiful about that, and so beautifully contrasted to like the brutality and the soullessness and the clinicism with which the Israeli Navy just like shamelessly and brazenly flouted international law to kidnap and abduct us, to commandeer our boats and ultimately steal them from us. I mean, I think that there is, every time I tell this story, I just, it's so critical to emphasize that this is just pirate behavior that we would never tolerate from another country, to storm civilian vessels that are not the property of this other country, that are flagged to European nations or Southeast Asian nations, and just take the boats and literally kidnap their crews and chuck them inside the basement of the boats while they drive us to some port to be processed as terrorists. This is exceptional behavior for a state that has granted itself infinite exception and been indulged by allies in the West who live in permanent exception to the rules that they try to enshrine at the international level. So I think we wanted to put on we wanted to drag the world attention through this process to that kind of flagrant criminality back to the shores of Gaza. And as we found out on release from detention, when we learned that Gazan fishermen, because of the distracting nature of our mission, were able to fish for a couple of days to get food. I mean, it wasn't what we wanted originally, but some people were able to feed their families for some days, even if our aid never reached. And that, I think, is very, very beautiful and is a testament to the material consequences of this, more generally symbolic or abstract. It can feel very symbolic or abstract form of direct action, but actually it's very concrete and very material.
Yeah, that was one of the criticisms that was leveled at the flotilla, was that, by the Zionists themselves, was that this is not, carrying enough humanitarian aid, if it's carrying humanitarian aid at all, which was kind of an implicit acknowledgement, in my opinion, of what Israel was doing in terms of not just committing a genocide by military strikes and bombing, but was committing a genocide by restricting humanitarian aid, creating a famine, but then also controlling the distribution sites, which we've now have found out because of this temporary ceasefire, if it holds, that as Gazans are returning to these humanitarian aid sites, that some of these groups that were involved, the so-called Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which was run by the U.S. and Israel, were burning the hoarded food. They were burying it. They were letting it rot. So we're seeing this level of brutality, but the accusation against the flotilla is sort of an admission by Israel of what it's actually doing and its intent. So if it was not, if these things were not needed, then why would it need to stop, a humanitarian flotilla? I do want to ask, again, this is not your experience. I'm assuming you're a person of conscience. You're somebody who knows this issue very well, wouldn't make this claim that what you experienced in detention compares anything to what people were experiencing in the genocide, but also in Israeli prisons. For decades, some of the prisoners that were released recently were incarcerated for decades. Many of them had life sentences, and some of the bodies of those who had been slain, who were released, showed clear signs of torture. Summary field executions. Just all kinds of malignant behavior towards the living and the dead. And but you saw that sort of so-called counter-terrorist infrastructure in person as a Westerner, as somebody who is an American citizen. Can you describe to us what you encountered, what you experienced? There was images of Ben Gvir mocking you and like saying all kinds of things, calling you a terrorist and those things. And I remember like this kind of moment of disconnect in how there was the same sort of accusations made against the Palestinian resistance, who were showing photos of the captured Israelis. They were saying, oh, like this is a violation of international law. But this was aired on like Israeli on Israeli national television as something to be celebrated, as an expression of power. And there was almost like no comment from the West in this kind of behavior. Can you just talk about that, like what it was like in these dungeons? What it was like, your personal experience, what you saw, the IDF, soldiers. What were they like? How did they behave towards the flotilla participants?
Yeah. So I think that it is really important to emphasize that for us, this was an experience, and for our brothers and sisters in Palestine, this is just reality. It's a reality to live in Ben Gvir's world. It's reality to live in a world of completely extrajudicial detention, where the concept of due process or fundamental rights just simply doesn't exist. And that's kind of the world that we entered in, and maybe we're a little bit naive about entering. This was, of course, was announced, but for a long time ahead of our arrival. that that we would be treated as terrorists upon arrival. And somehow, I think it didn't click in my head totally that that is exactly the book that we were going to be read. You know, that we would be living in that kind of cloud of kind of really psychotic and murderous, abusive and torturous detention. So yeah, I think, you know, some of these behaviors are so flagrant and so strange and so fascistic. Like, I'll give you an example. When we arrived to the port of Ashdod and they stripped everyone of their jewelry and just confiscated all of their belongings. This is something that has happened in other societies that, you know, we would imagine Israel would not want to be compared to. But you know, people were going through detention processes or being processed, and you know, having their like critical medicines just thrown in the trash, and people saying, you know, I need those to survive. And you know, I don't want to put too much emphasis on them, but like, you know, this country, the United States, is the primary military, economic, and diplomatic sponsor of the state of Israel. And you had veterans who had served in the U.S. military with medicine from the VA, and Israel would throw medicine away from the. I mean, it was so perfect in terms of like, this is how far Israel is willing to go. And I think that's really what we're trying to emphasize as, you know, participants of the flotilla, but also now as ambassadors for that project, is to say, you know, this is how far they've come. This is how far they're willing to go. If they're willing to do this, you know, to representatives of the global community from 45 different countries, if they're willing to do this to, you know, grandmothers and grandfathers and doctors and lawyers and teachers from all these different countries, and we can only imagine what is being done, as one of your viewers is pointing out, to the 7,000 Palestinians who are still being kind of illegally, unlawfully detained, you might say, you know, kidnapped or sequestered or taken hostage by the state of Israel, just since 2023 alone. So, you know,
actually, like, what did they actually, like, under what grounds did they like detain you? Was it because you were terrorists? Were you committing like what was it? Like, were you committing piracy? Was that the like their justification for
so
taking you?
we were never charged with anything. We never saw a lawyer. We never saw a prosecutor. We never saw a judge. We were never part of the judicial process. We were just strip tied and shackled and disappeared into the desert. And we're living in that extrajudicial world. I think that in retrospect, you might say that we were considered prisoners of war. So living in that kind of strange universe where you can be systematically denied certain rights and not others. And so we were. I mean, you know, at times there would be, you know, no food, no water, definitely no sleep. They would play footage of October 7th on loop for 3, 6, 9 hours every single day on maximum volume on giant screens they put up in the cell blocks for us to watch. They would beat people.
What do you mean images of October 7th?
So, I mean, on our cell block. So we were taken to basically the Guantanamo Bay of Israel, which was a 99-acre detention camp on the Egyptian border, where a prison that had become famous both for detaining a lot of the political prisoners from the first Intifada, but also was shut down, I think, in 92 and reopened in 2002 because of severe human rights violations that were documented by international human rights NGOs and Israeli NGOs. So it was gloriously reopened, this giant detention camp where we were taken. And in 1 second, someone's knocking. Hi, I'm in the middle of something.
While David is taking a moment, I just wanted to let everyone know that this is kind of a weird transition, but the Red Media team is looking for a new executive director. We, you know, are growing in terms of our reach and our programming, but we also, you know, are looking to hire somebody for a role of executive director of our programming. So if you know somebody, or you yourself are interested in applying, you can check that out at redmedia.press. You can just go straight to the website. There should be a job posting directly online there for you to check out. That's redmedia.press. And we're looking for a new executive director. So if that's something that interests you, please, you know, please please check that out. Looks like we have David back. David, we did a quick commercial break. You were talking about some pretty harrowing details about the Negev Desert prison that once, housed the people of, was it the first Intifada, and then
Yeah.
later shut down because of human rights abuses, but now being used, reopened and being used as a detainment camp for the Freedom Flotilla.
Yeah. And so I think I was explaining that in our cell block, they, just for us, purchased these two large televisions. They zip tied and strapped to the grating on the cell block walls, where they played this sort of October 7th documentary, dramatized montage of horrific images and footage on a loop at maximum volume for between 6 and maybe 9 hours a day, every day, to try to keep us awake and to, have us, pay attention. This is the terror you support, and, this is why you're here. And from
Were
the
you
get-go,
were you kept together as a group or small groups, or were you isolated in separate cells?
yeah, so there were just so many of us. I mean, 460 people. It's like a lot of people to put into prison. So we were divided into different cell blocks. I was on a 19 cell block, so about 250 people in those cells, and they would move us around constantly, make announcements constantly, bring in riot gear crew with German shepherds and with shotguns and with tear gas and with batons to beat people up and to shackle and detain them. If you were being rowdy or you put up any kind of resistance to that process, you were be taken away and thrown into solitary for the day, shackled at hands and ankles and blindfolded. And we'd be taken regularly into interrogation rooms with Mossad agents who would question us about what we were doing there, who paid for us to join the flotilla. I mean, they couldn't understand how this thing had come together or come to fruition, or what had motivated us. They couldn't understand the moral convictions that we held with each other. So it was, as you say, shocking but not surprising in this way. Like, wow, these people have really lost the plots. And in some ways, clearly they felt we had fallen into their trap. In some ways, clearly they felt that they had warned us that this was going to happen, and we had just, gone into it anyway. But in many ways, I feel the opposite. This mission sought to expose true colors and try to communicate to the world the extent to which this siege was being maintained criminally, illegally, and through brute force. And in many ways, I'm kind of grateful for the ways in which the decision, I should say, to take us deep in the Negev Desert to this infamous detention camp, because I feel like that was a gateway for a lot of people to ask about, as you say, this archipelago of detention, torture, prison camps where thousands of Palestinians are being held. And if we suffered even like a day or 2 or 3 or 5, in my case, of what many people are suffering for months, years, decades, then it's our responsibility to try to communicate and try to invite further interrogation into, further investigation into what may or may not be happening there. One of the principal achievements of the state of Israel over the past 2 years has been to keep out journalists from the international community, to target and kill journalists living in Palestine, and of course to deactivate any type of curiosity or accountability in Israeli society about what may be happening in these torture camps, the fragments of which we know to be absolutely appalling on a scale that's as bad, if not much, much worse than things that happened, for example, at Abu Ghraib. And so, one of the hopes that I had coming out of detention was, well, if this can be, certainly there must have been some reaction or response to, Nick, what is the single largest abduction of U.S. American citizens by an ally, let alone an adversary in the 21st century, and was obviously hugely dismayed to find that there had not been, that the Western press had not had not led some investigation to say, okay, where are they taking these people? And there was no Democratic senator who showed up at our prison to ask if they could see us. I mean, there was no healthy response by our sort of representatives, be they in our civil social institutions or in our political legislature, to try to find out what exactly was happening. And I think that only reveals even further the extent to which we have become apologists for this appalling violence and the degradation of the international law in ways that, as you say, menace the world.
Yeah. Yeah, it's, you said they lost the plot. I wonder if this was the plot all along.
Fair enough.
And it's been, playing itself out, and maybe in ways that we just haven't seen or refuse to see, as you say. I mean, we are all complicit in this, and I think that's one of the things that I'm trying to grapple with as well in my own, my own personal life. I don't want to not trying to make it about me, and you're not trying to make it about yourself either. This is about Gaza. This is about ceasefire. This is about justice. And this brings me to my final question, because I think, I listened to your story. It makes me think a lot about things that my own ancestors have gone through. And I always just wonder, like, what's the point of this senseless, like, violence? What's the point of this genocide? And if it wasn't to kill, it's so that somebody remembers, like, and I feel like in some ways the experience that you had, although it was, minor in comparison to what many prisoners are going through in Israeli dungeons, nonetheless is meant to scar, to frighten, to create a sense of trauma, so that you'll never forget, right? In that context. And I think at a collective level in the globe, I don't think a lot of people are going to forget this genocide. It's seared into our brains. It's seared into our psyche. It's seared into our souls. And there is this sense of invulnerability that I see, even with this kind of intimate violence that you experience at the hands of the IDF and the occupation soldiers within these prisoners, not a projection of power, but a projection of weakness. If your project is held upon these principles and tactics, then what is your project at the end of the day?
And I think, Nick, this is a great place to really conclude our discussion, not only because I think that so many of us, all of us, I should say, have come back from this mission more committed than ever to the cause of Palestinian liberation, saying, we will sail again, we will break this siege, and we will see a free Palestine. But because I'm more convinced than ever of what you just said, having been up close and personal now with this architecture, with this apparatus of repression and oppression and dispossession, I've never been more convinced of its lack of structural integrity. When I was in that prison, especially when we were leaving and we were traveling through this 99-acre detention camp, all I could think to myself was, one day these cells will be empty. And this whole apparatus that's been constructed, on someone else's land, these will be destroyed, will be dismantled. And you asked me earlier about, like, the behavior of the IDF, and this wasn't even the IDF. These were concentration camp guards, like almost like private security, and they were brutal and they were brutish and they were awful, but they weren't. It felt like we're winning this thing. The desperation, the lashing out, the violence, the senseless violence, as you say, Nick, it's all revealing of an insecurity, a deep insecurity, a political insecurity of a project that does not feel that it has a spiritual attachment to this land, that knows something about the bankruptcy and the illegitimacy of its political claims that it's trying to make, that knows that it's lying through its gritted teeth to the world, and therefore knows that it's unsustainable in trying to marshal those lies day after day, month after month, year after year. So I think that's my feeling on the other end of that experience, as kind of harrowing as it was, and as much as my heart breaks every single day for the people who will continue to suffer from these horrible conditions, is that Palestine will be free. And that's going to take all of us working incredibly hard and putting our lives on the line, putting our bodies in the middle of, I know, a lot of difficult struggles, but I've never felt more certain of that.
David Adler, Thank you so much for joining the podcast. These are really powerful stories. I hope you can get some rest. I hope you can take care of yourself and get the healing that you need to fight back. And if there's anything that you want to uplift in this moment, where people can find your work, any campaigns that you're working on that you think need attention right now, what are those, and how can people get plugged in?
I think the main thing I would say is, we're already hard at work planning our next mission, which will probably take place when the sailing season starts again in spring or really early spring 2026. And my hope is that with even more time and preparation, with even more activation of our respective communities, that we can succeed in the mission where we failed on this one, and we can really break the siege, and we can reestablish that humanitarian corridor and set the conditions for the true self-determination for Gaza and for the people of Palestine at large.
Thanks so much, David Adler. David Adler is with the Progressive International. He's a friend of mine. I was texting our mutual friend who was giving me updates on his status when he was captured, and we're just glad you're back, and we can't wait to see what's going to happen next. I think this is the beginning of something much larger. So thanks so much, David, for your work, for your perspective, and yeah, we'll see you next time.